the impact of climate change without destroying the economy.
We really focus on enterprise sustainability. If they want to pursue a sustainable business model, they are able to engage a lot of stakeholders to join, like the customers, the investors, and the suppliers along the supply chains.
This is where we come the research institute and educational institute. If we identify a problem, we also can recommend ways to solve it. The Hong Kong University Business School has the most impressive research capabilities in Hong Kong and this entire region.
We are truly a multidisciplinary institute. Finance, accounting, economics, management, strategy, scholars come together and work on sustainability issues. We also see increasing demand from younger generations who want to study those issues. Jockey Club has been extremely supportive for the Sustainability Institute.
Hong Kong is a very fertile ground for that in the sense that we have many large, established, wealthy corporations that have a lot to gain from it. If you think about the change to cleaner energy, adopting new technology, in many companies, that's an opportunity. That's why they need people with t-shirts and not only with suits.
Our institute starts as a vision, and we aim to impact every business and every industry.
This is very young institute. We have here the opportunity to lead the world to reshape regulations in regard to climate change. And I think if we can do that, having Hong Kong as the flag carrier of this type of change, we've done our job. The world is facing a very severe problem.
Climate change is not just about science and data. What we actually feel is extreme weather, precipitation that results in massive floods.
Some projections are that in decades, 80% of Hong Kong GDP is going to be underwater.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's conference will begin in just 1 minute. Please take a seat as we will be starting very soon. Thank you.
Fast and decisively. The biggest question we face is how do we reduce the impact of climate change without destroying the economy?
We really focus on enterprise sustainability. If they want to pursue a sustainable business model, they are able to engage a lot of stakeholders to join, like the customers, the investors, and the suppliers along the supply chains.
This is where we come the research institute and educational institute. If we identify a problem, we also can recommend ways to solve it. The Hong Kong University Business School has the most impressive research capabilities in Hong Kong and this entire region.
We are truly a multidisciplinary institute. Finance, accounting, economics, management, strategy, scholars come together and work on sustainability issues. We also see increasing demand from younger generations who want to study those issues. Jockey Club has been extremely supportive for the Sustainability Institute.
Hong Kong is a very fertile ground for that in the sense that we have many large, established, wealthy corporations that have a lot to gain from it. If you think about the change to cleaner energy, adopting new technology, in many companies, that's an opportunity. That's why they need people with t-shirts and not only with suits.
Our institute starts as
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to today's conference, The Future of ESG Reporting, Navigating Global Standards and Regulation. We're very delighted to have you all here today for our very first distinguished ESG lecture. I'm Daniel, the Senior Manager of this institute and your MC for today. Before we start, just a quick few words about this institute. The Hong Kong U Jockey Club Enterprise Sustainability Global Research Institute. It was established in June this year by the Hong Kong U Business School and funded by the Jockey Club Charitable Trust. It is dedicated to top-tier ESG research, education, and forging partnerships. And we have many exciting events and initiatives coming up. So please stay tuned by subscribing to our social media channels. Now, without further ado, we have an exciting agenda lined up featuring esteemed speakers and panel discussion that promises to be engaging and insightful. Please join me in first welcoming Professor Guo Junhe, the Director of the ESG Research Institute, to deliver our welcoming remarks. Professor He, please.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and especially the distinguished speakers and also the panelists. So I'm the director of this institute. This is our first public lecture, and hope that this knowledge sharing is going to be useful, okay, to the practitioners today. I have a couple of slides which summarizes the events that we are organizing. And in which we actually anticipate more people to join us, more people to get engaged. Can you share the slides? So the first thing, today's topic is about ESG reporting. So just give you a flavor why this is important. Our school is doing its first sustainability report. It was just published. There is a QR bar here. And if you want to take a look at how our business school is doing, and you can get more detailed information. Right? I just want to highlight some of the numbers that we are delivering. Okay, the first is that right now we look at the entire school's curriculum. We have more than 30 plus ESG related courses spreading across economics, finance, accounting, management, strategy. And then last year, we launched this Master of Climate Governance and Risk Management jointly with the Institute of Climate Change and Carbon Neutrality. And if it's approved next year, we are going to launch a new ESG-related master program about sustainable financing and investment. And right now, in terms of research, we also look at the publications our scholars have produced in the past 3 years. We have 50 plus publications on top field journals in economics, finance, and accounting, which place us to be the #1 in the top business rankings, both on this particular issue and also on overall business research rankings, according to UT Dallas publications, journal list. Of course, our institute was established, and now we are organizing all kinds of activities. We very much look forward to more interactions in the future. We also engage a lot, spend quite some of our efforts trying to generate societal impacts. For example, we have this impact lab with more than basically our students have communicated about 150,000 hours to work to support more than 50 societal impact organizations. A little bit more data about gender balance. About 60% of our students are female, and about 1/3, close to nearly 1/3 of the faculty members are female. And we also have a very large alumni network spread across different continents. And we also calculated our carbon emissions, in which last year we emitted slightly less than 4,000 tons of carbon emissions just for Scope 1 and Scope 2. We are starting calculating Scope 3 emissions. So if next year you see a larger number being here, that's not because we are increasing our emissions, it's because we are trying to be more comprehensive about the calculation. And the university does have this carbon neutrality objective. We haven't decided if we should make kind of higher targets about our school's preference than the university's ones. But after our discussions, maybe next year, we will say something about our commitment in the future. I think I want to also introduce a bit more the activities that we try to engage corporates, as many of the audience today really come from the industry. So one thing is that we work with one of the leading financial magazine and media, Caijing, in China. We organize this closed-door ESG workshop for once for every 2 months. The idea is to gather leaders from different industries to share their opinions, also explore potential ways for collaboration with the academics. I think this is particularly a very good time to initiate those joint efforts because on the one hand, we do have many professors working on those issues, but they often, they don't find a way to deliver this knowledge to the practitioners. And this would be a very, very nice occasion in which we can communicate with the business world. And we do later, if you're interested to be involved in those closed-door workshops, and feel free to reach to our colleagues here and there, and then they will take notes. We have our first kind of ESG forum in June, and that is going to be happening again this year, next year, and the following years. Meanwhile, we are working with, I don't know if people can see this, we're working with KPMG for ESG case computation this year. And the final round will be at Hong Kong U. We received more than 1,000 teams submissions of ESG cases globally. And now we managed to reduce to 30 teams. And later, if we will post about information about this competition, if you're interested, we also welcome people to join. Finally, we are also doing executive educations. So there are many programs that we are developing. So one is likely for more senior leadership. One is more likely for practitioners. We also look forward to work with our speakers and organizations that are representing to join us those initiatives. Finally, that's for today, right? So this is our first distinguished ESG lecture series. On our campus, we do have many seminars and workshops and conference organizers, but they are mostly catered to academics, to scholars. We think one major role our institute is playing is basically trying to bridge the knowledge from academia to industry. So for this lecture series, it's going to be just like today, where we welcome everyone to participate. Some other programs that's lined up in the next few months, I just want to highlight here so people can follow us. The first thing is that we're going to have an environmental economics forum 2 days later in Beijing. It's going to be live streamed. If you're interested in environmental issues, that's something you can pay attention to. We are working with Hong Kong Economic Journal to launch another ESG forum in November, in which we try to get more kind of media and more stakeholders to participate. Meanwhile, we also have here we have this climate innovation conference in Haikou, in which we collaborated with several large institutes in China to make it to drive bigger change. I just want to highlight one last thing over there. In November, we are going to have this major events working with Jane Goodall Institute. Miss Jane Goodall is actually going to visit Hong Kong and share about her experiences, and we will be discussing issues on biodiversity in that event. So if you're interested, and Tanya has emphasized this, we do have multiple channels. You can follow us, and you will get the updates of all those events lined up. Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers and also our panelists, and then I will give the mic to them. So today we have two keynote speakers. First would be Professor Alexandra Besson. Can you please stand up so people can see you a bit? So Professor Besson is the chair of Greenhouse Gas Protocol Independent Standards Board, and he is going to be our first keynote speaker. And our second keynote speaker would be Professor Christine Lopata. She's the vice chair of EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board. Meanwhile, after the keynote speeches, we will have panel discussions in which we have Anthony from CISCA and also one of our teaching faculty at Hong Kong U. And we also have Bin Wang from Tongas and also representing CISCA. And finally, we also have Ms. Karen Hall, also from CISCA. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you will enjoy today's sharings. Now let's welcome Professor Besson to the stage.
Okay, let's carry on. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this very nice introduction. Thank you so much for inviting us today, to giving me the opportunity to talk about the greenhouse gas protocol. I'm actually from the University of Hamburg, which is in Germany, and I know some of you from the Certified ESG Analyst program down there. If not, you can still participate there. I'm very happy to present what we are doing right now with the greenhouse gas protocol. I took over the chair beginning of this year due to a change in the governance structure of the greenhouse gas protocol. So first of all, I would like to introduce a little bit what we are doing, what the aim of the GHGP is, and then the next steps where we are heading to. So it's not really an academic lecture, of course, but it's more an implementation of what we are doing with the GHGP. So first of all, as I just said, I would like to give you an overview of what we are doing, where we are coming from, where the GHGP is coming from. Generally, the idea of the greenhouse gas protocol is that this is a global standard for climate accounting and also for climate reporting. So the idea is we would like to measure greenhouse gas emissions of corporates in the operations, but also in the value chain. So it's an approach how we can measure the responsibility for climate change of different companies. And we can also see if they are on track with their climate targets they set. And the whole organization was until 2022 based on 6 people. So a global standard for climate reporting with 6 people who wrote the standards. Of course, they had committees that worked on that, but this was more or less it. And that changed because the whole reporting landscape changed and also the responsibility changed. So right now, there are more than 10,000 companies that use the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. This is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There's a global reporting standard, the ISSB, which will also become mandatory in Hong Kong. And the assumption is that there will be more than 100,000 companies using this standard. And my colleague, Professor Lepata, will describe a little bit the connection of the ISSB and also the European standard, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, which will cover 50,000 companies that mandatorily have to report about the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is quite a lot. So you can imagine that an organization with 6 people can hardly write the climate reporting standard for this global approach. And this was also the idea while the GHGP said, okay, we have to change something. So we cannot just go ahead with this organization. And there were a lot of discussions, is GHGP independent enough? Because there were 2 host organizations. One is the World Resource Institute based in Washington, D.C., and the other is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development located in Geneva. So they started the whole process, and they started this process already in 1998. So just in front of all the discussions we had with terms of climate change, climate reporting, you know, CDP started later, and also the effects of climate change we see on a global basis right now. And the interesting thing is that the founding members are still on board. They are still working there. Pankaj is one of them. And it's quite good to learn that the whole process of the global reporting standard. I just pointed out some of the standards that you can see. I will describe them a little bit in detail later, just to give you a flavor of what we are working on right now and what are the challenges if you want to start a reporting standard. I found it quite interestingly what you described with scope 1 and 2. To start with scope 1 and 2 emissions for HKU Business School, which is a good approach to do it like that. We did something similar at our university. I had the pleasure to be for almost 10 years the head of the sustainability department of the whole university. So I know what a burden it can be if you have to write a sustainability report. It's not always fun. So there you can see the timeline when we develop different standards. And what you can also see is that a lot of these standards are quite, let's say, mature. So some of them are more than 10 years, 12 years, 13 years old, and used by a lot of companies already. But we do see, and GHGP made this decision, that we need an update. And this is, of course, what the corporates also want, to have an update on the different standards of greenhouse gas reporting. And I just mentioned before that the GHG protocol is used by different standard setter. We see that also other standards rely on what we are doing, ISO or PCAF for the financial institutions. You are aware of the Science-Based Target Initiative. They are also working with the GHGP standards. There is a draft of climate reporting also in the US, so the SEC based their reporting on it. Christian will explain later what Europe is doing, and we also have a lot of voluntary standards, the GRI, CDP, and also the IFRS Foundation with the ISSB. They are all using the greenhouse gas protocol. And you can imagine what I just said, there's a strong pressure on having a reliable governance structure at the GHGP. So, but this is not all, there are even more. For target setting, what I just said, Science-Based Target Initiative, also for voluntary market, it became more and more important to have a reliable standard to base the reporting on. And of course, also when you look at the different data provider for financial institutions, also these institutions usually base their reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Moody's, MSCI, Sustainalytics, S&P, and all the others that are out there are all based on this one standard. So that means the GHGP is not only 6 people anymore. The decision was made 2 years ago to change the governance structure. Now we have this structure you can see on the left-hand side. So we have the 2 co-hosts I mentioned before, WRI and WBCSD. Then we have a steering committee that is more making the funding decisions, strategic decisions. They meet approximately 6 times a year. And then we have the Independent Standards Board, where I have the honor to be the chair of. And the Independent Standard Board will make the final decisions on the standards. That's the idea. We are, as the ISB, are supported by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat, which has now 36 members, so it's also growing. And we have a lot of technical working groups. And these technical working groups, that's what the name says already, they are working. So that means they are working on writing the standards, having the detailed discussions on the standards. That's what the technical working groups are doing. We have approximately 170 members in the technical working groups. So the ISB is still very small. We'll have a maximum of 18 members. And you can see that there are some people missing. So just to give you some examples, Heather is from Australia. Susan Green is from Dow. Heather's from university. Danny is from a research institute. So there are lacks in terms of people from Asia. You can see that over there. Inhi, she's had sustainability from Samsung. But there are still, I would say, open positions. So let's see what the future development will be. The challenge is, if you have a global organization, you have to find a balance for your timing. So we have the next board meeting today at 9 a.m. So 9 p.m., of course, a.m. for the others. And this is what makes the work quite interesting. So that's more the governance structure we are working on right now. So we have the steering committee, we have the Independent Standards Board, the ISB, with until now 6 members, 2 on the pipeline, and we have a maximum of 8. We have to make the decisions. Decisions on what? On the update of the corporate standards. And we are working now on 4 different standards in parallel in the updating process. The corporate standard, which is more the general standard for corporate reporting, the Scope 2 guidance, Scope 2 standard, which is on indirect emissions for energy, heat, and steam, what you're using. Scope 3, the most favorite standard. Next year, also HKU will report their Scope 3 emissions. I like that. And we also have a new standards called action and market instruments, due to the fact that in all these standards, market instruments are mentioned. So the question of offsetting is discussed there. And this is something where we'll have a new standard on action and market instruments. Beside that, we are also working already on a standard for land and forest sector. So also this will be interesting because a lot of companies have issues with their, especially forest, and how to account for the forest. So if a company owns forest, does that mean that reduces their CO2 emissions because they're the owner of the forest, or isn't that something that already belongs to the state, or is just driven by nature? So there are very intensive discussions on this land and forest sector right now. So if you're interested, of course, you will get all the slides. We have a lot of links there where you find what we did in the last 2 years. We did a survey. So we asked the users, the civil society, politicians, what do you like and what you don't like regarding the GHG protocol? Where do we have to improve? And as you can see, we got a lot of feedback. And all this updating process we are in right now is based on this feedback. And the feedback was very, very open, I have to say. And if you look at what we are doing now in the different standards, we are completely focusing on this feedback we got from the user of the greenhouse gas protocol. There are different aspects that are changed compared to when we started more than 20 years ago. One is the interoperability between the different standards. So this is something we have to look at. How do they fit together? Scope 2, Scope 3, corporate standard. What is best practice that developed in the last couple of years? Also, this is something we have to take into account. But also the interoperability with existing standards, existing reporting standards. I will show you 2 examples on one of the next slides, how we are handling this process and what we are doing there. We are also working on guidance, because it's not enough anymore to write a standard. You have to have very clear guidance to support corporates, institutions to write the standards. So that's why we are also working on writing these standards, these guidance to implement and to use the standards. So what is the scope of work? Now we dig a little bit deeper into the content. And I would just show you some examples of what we are working on and what the effect of these standards, these changes are. So let's start with a corporate standard. You can see we have a lot of topics we will cover in this updating process. And one is the question of organizational boundaries and operational boundaries. Usually in the standard, it says you have to focus on the boundaries of the company. So from financial reporting, you know that these boundaries, organizational boundaries, or operational boundaries. That means you have additional influence on the value chain, on the products, for example. And until now, it says very clearly, you can choose 2 approaches. You can use the operational control or the financial control. In the standards, Professor Patter will present later the European standards. It says, first, you have to start with your financial control approach, and then in addition, the operational control approach. This sounds, if you just listen to that, well, okay, just a different approach. But it makes a huge difference in terms of reporting if you just have to report about your own company, or if you have to report about those where you have an operational influence. So this is just one discussion we will have on the corporate standard. Another example from the Scope 2 standards update. Scope 2 standard is on the question of what kind of energy are you using, steam and heat, where do you get this from? And one example I would like to pick here is the difference between the location-based approach and the market-based approach. What is the difference? Location-based approach means if you account for your carbon emissions, you're looking at the country, the energy mix of your country. So you just take the energy mix of your country, and then you have the factors to calculate your CO2 emissions. Market-based approach means you focus on the contracts you do have as a company with your energy supplier. This is in a lot countries don't make a huge difference because there is just still a monopoly. Just looking to Bien. In other jurisdictions, it does make a difference because you have a variety of different supplies you can use. You can use between renewable, non-renewable, nuclear power, whatever you would like to have. So it does make a difference over there if you have a location-based or a market-based approach. And this is something where we have to be much clearer in the definition within the greenhouse gas protocol, which approach is the correct one, or how can you choose which is the approach, or how can you combine these approaches. And for a lot of people, the favorite Scope 3 standard, the Scope 3 standard describes the emission upstream and downstreams. So you have the corporate, and then you have the supply chain, and then you have the emissions of your products. Just for an example, we have 15 different categories for Scope 3, upstream and downstream. And also there, of course, the general question we are addressing here is, how do you set the boundaries? So where does the company end? So is it Scope 2 because you're using energy? Or is it Scope 3 because it's in your value chain? So this is one important aspect. And also the question of materiality. So is it really material, this type of emission you do have in the value chain? One very important driver is the data quality, of course, because very often you do not have access to the emissions of your supplier. That would be Scope 3 upstream. You don't have it. So you have to estimate it. But how are you going to estimate it? Of course, you need guidance. You need more guidance to do that. And if you have a background in financial accounting, you know that these estimates in the value chain is something the auditor does not really like. So therefore, you have to have a very clear guidance of how to handle this challenge of data quality and the different calculation methods we are facing there. The last one, as I mentioned before, actions and market instruments. So this is a new standard, does not exist. We are working on that. And the question is, how do you handle market instruments in the greenhouse gas emissions reports? So how do you handle, for example, offsetting you do have? Does that really reduce your CO2 emission? We had a discussion, not we, but the SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, they had a discussion because the idea was, okay, where is the correct point to integrate the offsetting in the transition plans of a company? Is it just at the end when you say, well, I have residual emissions I cannot use anymore, so then I have to offset, or can you do it earlier? And this is a discussion we will have there with the action and market instruments, and also who can account for these emission reductions in the value chain. So you do see, I just picked some of these updates we were working on. The idea is that we will finish the update of the whole standards at least within the next 2 years, which is very ambitious. As I just said, we have now 4 technical working groups, and these 4 technical working groups with 170 members, they had the first meeting on last week, and they will meet almost on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to write and develop the standards. So this is a lot of work. Plus, this is a multi-stakeholder approach. It's not an approach based on corporates only or civil society only. So that means there are different opinions of what is good. The common understanding is that we need a reliable sustainability and especially greenhouse gas reporting, but the way, the speed, and the different steps, the assumption of these different approaches is completely different. So these discussions are very controversial, and you need a very good moderator within the technical working groups to do so. And I'm pretty confident that the setup we do have right now with this new governance structure is really helpful in that sense. We also have and this was also the idea of changing the governance structure, a very good overview of all the documents that are relevant. So the terms of references, conflict of interest policies, everything you do not really want to read, but which is, I think, very important to have a guidance for this updating process. So if you're interested in that, it's all on the website of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and that is the idea we are, we think that makes greenhouse gas reporting more reliable in the future. We think it is necessary to do so. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion later. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Basin. Thank you. Please take a seat. Next, we'll have another distinguished speaker. Please welcome Professor Kirsten Lopata, Vice Chair of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board EU. Professor Lopata, please.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. And as you heard from my colleague Alexander Bassen, he was talking about the greenhouse gas protocol. The greenhouse gas is a measurement, so to say, that we use in our European sustainability reporting standards. And that is my topic for today, as you can see. So I'm talking about sustainability reporting in Europe and globally. So what you see nowadays is that we in Europe have mandatory reporting about sustainability issues. So ESG is now mandatory to report. And we started that process, and this will be on my first slide, in 2020. So 4 years ago, almost. And we had a regulation before that was not saying it is mandatory to report. And the main downside that we had before was that we cannot compare the information that was given by most of the companies. So as I said, we reported before on ESG topics, but the comparison was very hard. So that's why in 2020, the European Union more or less said, well, let's discuss this regulation. And we came up with the so-called new regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And within this directive, that's what you see over here, the European Commission needed someone who develops the standards, because the European Commission itself did not do the standards. So they choose the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, in short, EFRAG. By that time, EFRAG was only doing financial reporting standards, and we more or less overlooked these standards because they were mainly they have been mainly done by the IFRS. So if you're studying financial accounting, you know we have the IFRS and we have the regulation behind that. And with this, the European Union was not very satisfied, so to say. So with European sustainability reporting standards, they said, well, let's do it on our own. So that's why they established the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and they asked EFRAG to develop the standards. And EFRAG then started the process, and you see over here, it was a project task force they started with. And my colleague Alexander Basten was part of this task force, and he developed with a couple of other people the standards. In 2022 then, we established at EFRAG a second pillar, so to say. As I just said, we had the financial reporting at EFRAG, and we established in 2022 sustainability reporting, and we established a board. And I'm a member of this board, and so we are a very diverse board, and we have preparers, we have scientists like me, we have standard setters like from the national standard setters, we have preparers, we have NGOs. So about 20 people on that board that established or that developed the standards for sustainability reporting that you see right now in the European Union. So when I took over the seat, I had the standards from my colleague in front of me. And so when we started, we had about 2,500 data points. As you think of financial reporting, these are really a lot of data points. And if you think about data points, we also talk about narratives. So it's not only a KPI we also have narratives that we describe. And by that time, the board of the the chair of the sustainability reporting board has not been established because it's a very long process before the chair came into place. So I was asked to take over for half a year. And in the beginning, they said, well, it's only 4 weeks, but then it took a little bit longer, as it usually is in a process like that. And I remember the first time I said, well, let's do it. And I took over the acting chair role. I had a talk with a commissioner from the EU. And she said basically, Kirsten, we have 2,500 data points. That's way too much. Cut it by half, that's what she said, and deliver on time. So that means I had half a year with the board, of course, so with all of my colleagues. And we did within half a year, basically what the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive says. And from my perspective, these are 4 main points that change the landscape in sustainability reporting quite a lot. And I have them on these slides. So first of all, and my colleague Alexander Bassen mentioned that already, we have now, so coming up in the next year, in the next years, more than 50,000 companies that have to report under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So that means the scope is extended. And as you can see, if you fulfill 2 of these 3 criteria that are mentioned over here. So if you have more than 250 employees, more than 50 million sales, or more than 25 million total assets, so 2 out of 3, you have to report. And it's also, so the scope is also over listed SMEs. So we have a little bit of a transition period. So like a phasing in over the next year. So from 2024 to 2028, basically, these are the timeframe companies have to report or coming into the reporting. The second point you see on my slide is the external assurance. So if you know financial accounting, we have to audit the reports with reasonable assurance, right? So reasonable assurance, we said from the beginning, is very hard because first of all, you have to establish the standards, and then the audit companies also need the knowledge, the people who are auditing the reports. So that's why we said, well, let's start with limited assurance for sustainability reporting. But in the long run, we are also looking for reasonable assurance. And this also shows that we are thinking sustainability reporting and financial reporting should be on the same level, at least auditing related, but also with the information that we give. A third point that is also within the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is that we would like to collect all the data that are coming from the reports. So why we are doing it? Because we would like to fulfill the Paris alignment. And as we saw with the regulation before, we do not have enough data. That's why we're now collecting the data to see, are we on the 1.5 degree path? Are we above? Are we below? So this also is the point for digitalization here. And we will collect these information in the so-called European single electronic format. Also coming from financial accounting, we usually text the information and we collect then the KPIs or the narratives. So we do the same for sustainability reporting. We already saw that we are a little bit behind, so it will start 1 year after the reports of the companies. So that means the first companies have to report in 2025 about 2024. This will be the first information that will be given. Last but not least, and I said that already, so EFRAG developed the standards, and then we handed over to the European Commission, and they, of course, did some modifications, they worked on it, and then that's what you see nowadays, what they already published. What is also important is that we have to, when we develop the standards, to look at other frameworks. So that means, as you can see over here, we had to look at GRI when we developed the standards. We also looked at SASB. We had a look at IASB as well as TCFD while, as said, developing our standards. So what you see nowadays is the following set of standards, and we call it set 1. It's cross-cutting, so that means it's not industry specific. And we have 2 more or less overarching standards. This is ESRS number 1 and ESRS number 2, where we talk about more or less how we frame sustainability reporting. That's ESRS number 1. And number 2 is mandatory. And here you see all the general disclosures that have to be given by the companies. The rest, as you can see, are 10 standards. They're environmental, social, and governance related. As you can see, for the environment, we have in total 5 standards. Then for social, we have 4. And for governance, as it is only sustainability related, we only have 1 standard that we developed. What is very important in our standard setting is a so-called double materiality assessment. And I will talk a little bit later also on the international development of sustainability standards, but we are looking from an impact perspective as well as from a financial perspective. Again, if you're familiar with financial accounting, you know already we have a financial impact, and we are adding now the so-called materiality impact over here. So the so-called double materiality assessment, DMA, is more or less the heart of every sustainability report. That's why we're focusing on it very much. And the description of this is also in the cross-cutting standards. So how you developed a so-called DMA, a double materiality analysis. And here you see how we thought about it when we developed the standards. So first of all, we have a so-called due diligence process. And that comes a little bit from the M&A discussions. So due diligence in our context means every year you're overlooking all the standards I just showed you, right? So all E, S, and G standards are in your due diligence. But then you say, okay, they meet a so-called threshold to become material. And only if a standard becomes material, you have to report about it. Except ESRS number 1, it's a climate standard. If you say this is not material, you have to explain why. But for all other standards, if you find out they're not material, you're not reporting about them. Very important. So when we delivered our standards from EFRAG to the EU, we said ESRS number E1 should be mandatory as well as part of S1, so some social standards, but they cut it back. So the European Commission said, well, let's do the companies their assessment, and then they know best what is material and what is not material. Okay, so this is the idea behind it. And within your due diligence, as you see over here in my flowchart, you do the materiality assessment. ESRS 2 is mandatory, and then you might have some other ESRS that are mandatory in your assessment. And then you end up with so-called material matters. And about these material matters, you at the end reporting. And you see, we have an internal proceeding until the material matters. And what you see over there at the end is always ESRS 2 because it's mandatory, plus everything that is getting mandatory, that's becoming material within your assessment. Okay. And very important also is that we place the information about this report within the management discussion and analysis. So it becomes a part of the financial reporting right now. That is also very important, and we discussed it a lot. When we delivered our standards to the Commission and the Commission published it, they said, well, thanks for the standards, but we now need you to do some implementation guidance because no one especially knows. I mean, if you did GRI reporting before, you know what a stakeholder analysis is. But many companies that are becoming mandatory reporters now within the scope do not know how to perform a materiality analysis. So that's why the Commission said, okay, please prepare some implementation guidance. And we started with what we thought is the most important one. So the implementation guidance number 1, that is the materiality assessment. And we describe how we see the materiality assessment. So stakeholder analysis, how you should set your thresholds, for example, etc. Very important from the EFRAG perspective is these implementation guidance do not go through the whole EU process. So they're done by EFRAG and they're published by EFRAG. You know, it's a different level. So the sustainability reporting standards, they're published by the European Commission. So this is only published by EFRAG. I know because we are doing a lot of work with practitioners, especially audit firms, that they take it for granted. So they say we need something that we can prove against. And they say, this is what we prove against. So in the audit, they take it and they say, that's, you know, our audit proof. And they take it as it is a mandatory guidance, just to let you know. After we finish the materiality assessment, and as I said, it's very detailed. So we're explaining, for example, our impact, risk, and opportunity matters and how we would quantify them. We also took care of the value chain. That was also mentioned already by my colleague, because if we go for scope 3, we are in the value chain, and this is also mandatory reporting. So we also have an implementation guidance over the value chain. And last but not least, we also list all our data points, which are roughly 1,200, in an Excel sheet, and we're explaining them. And this is our implementation guidance number 3 that we prepared already. Well, moving on, I said the EFRAG established a second pillar, that was the Sustainability Reporting Board. Almost at the same time, the IFRS said, well, we cannot leave the Europeans alone. You know, we also need a global standard for that. And we discussed it a lot, and also within EFRAG, but I think it's very important that we have a global standard, because the rest of the world will not say, well, let's keep the European standards, we will just apply them. So that's why I think it's very important that the IFRS, they also established a second pillar to their, next to their financial reporting. They also established a sustainability reporting board. It's the ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Setting Board. And we started almost at the same time when we developed the standards. The difference, or there are many differences. So first of all, the ISSB is only focusing on financial materiality. I was a little bit explaining the double materiality. So the ISSB is only focusing on investors, as they do in financial reporting. Okay, so the impact materiality is not an issue in ISSB standards. That is a huge difference. Well, the second difference is they wrote the time when we established 12 standards, they did 2 standards. They did more or less an overarching standard. It's the IFRS S1, and the S2 is then the climate standard that they established. And when we were working, parallel to each other, we of course talked with each other. And when I was the acting chair, I invited Sue Lloyd, so she is the vice chair of the ISSB. And we talked about the climate standard, of course, because that's what we developed in parallel. And a lot of companies were telling us, guys, work together. And we would like to have a so-called interoperability. So that means if we apply the European standards, we automatically fulfill the regulation of the international standard. That was not that easy, having in mind that we have the double materiality and they only have the financial materiality. So, and we also didn't have time, I have to say. So, I mean, we talked with each other, but they developed their standard and we developed our standards. I mean, from an economic perspective, that is not very good, of course. You know, if you do something in parallel, you should talk with each other and do the same things at least. But at the end, we published our standards and we had a 1-year discussion about how to do this interoperability with the ISSB. We published an interoperability table a couple of months ago, where you can see if you apply the European standards, how to get to the ISSB. And coming from a more granular standard in the EU, it's very easy, I have to say. I think it's only 4 or 5 data points, depending on the reporting, that you have to fulfill additionally if you do the European standards to get in line with the international standards. It's not that easy if you start with the international standards, because they are not that granular, to also fulfill the European standards. So that's a broader task in this area. But we are still working with each other. So they also have on their work plan something like biodiversity or human capital that we also have in our standards right now. So we are working, as I said, with each other, but they have a little bit of a different approach. All right, what I also said in the beginning, we are also drafting right now our SET1 XBRL taxonomy. That is very important for the tagging that I just mentioned. So we are also working on it, and we are almost at the end. So this is also coming up very soon. And giving a look ahead, after the game is before the game. So when we finished our cross-cutting standards, we started to work on sector-specific standards. That's also something that is mentioned in the CSRD. That's why we are doing it. And we started, first of all, with our SEC 1, which is more or less the explanation which industry we are focusing on. And we are working on 2 sector-specific standards right now. That is oil and gas, so OG, and mineral, quarry, and coal. These are the 2 sector standards we are on our way developing. In parallel, we are also developing a standard for listed small and medium-sized entities. That's also covered by the CSRD. And we also have a standard that we call voluntary small and medium-sized entities, because all of the companies that are right now reporting, they are also asking the smaller companies to deliver some information. And to make life easier also for the smaller ones, that it would be good to also have a voluntary standard that they follow, so that they see what information they have to deliver. And we are also working on a non-EU standard. That means if you're outside the EU and you have businesses in the EU, also with certain thresholds of revenues, then this also applies to the companies outside of the EU. Well, that was more or less my starting point over here. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on the panel.
Thank you so much, Professor Lopata, for your fascinating presentation. Okay, before our next section, we would like to invite everyone to join us for a group photo to commemorate this event. Please remain in your seats while our photographer take a photo. So, in this juncture, I would like to, on behalf of the Research Institute, thank all our supporting organizations who have been extremely supportive for this afternoon's event. They are CESCA, the Certified ESG Analyst Program, Climate Governance Initiative Hong Kong, CPA Australia, Friends of the Earth, HU iCube, and the Hong Kong Institute of Data Analytics. Thank you so much for all your incredible support. Let's take a group photo. Let's give a thumbs up. Let's give a thumbs up. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Moving on to the panel discussion, the topic here today is the impact of global and EU sustainability reporting and philanthropy. Our moderator for this section is Mr. Bien Wong, Board Governor, Friends of the Earth Hong Kong. Our panelists include Professor Alexander Basin, Professor Kirsten Lopata, Mr. Anthony Jung, Supervisory Board Member of the World Benchmarking Alliance,
Thank you very much. And firstly, I would like to say thank you to the HKE Jockey Club Enterprise Sustainability Global Research Institute for organizing today's insightful session. And good afternoon. Welcome to our panel discussion. And I'm Bien, and I'll be your moderator for this important session. With me today, and esteemed panelists, as I was talking to all the panelists saying that I'm very honored because I managed to have a direct dialogue with the CESCA lecturers in person. And we should take this opportunity later. I'll open to the floor for a Q&A session. I'll introduce once again for the esteemed panelists. We have Professor Alexander Basin, the chair of the GHG Protocol Independence and Standards Board. We have Professor Kirsten Lopata, Vice Chair of FX Sustainability Reporting Board. We have Professor Anthony Jung, the Supervisory Board Member of WBA. And last but not least is Karen Ho. She is the APEC Head of Sustainable Finance Regulations and Integration Market Specialist from Bloomberg. So without further ado, I think I'll start off with first question just now after listening to Professor Pata's sharing. And also I would like to tap into the professional knowledge of Karen for the evolving reporting standards in the global and the EU. Just now we know that there's the double materiality and also the financial materiality. And what are the distinguishing features like for the EU regulations are shaping the corporate disclosure practices? Can I pass over to you first, Professor Pata, please?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Well, as you know, companies basically coming from financial reporting, that's what they are more familiar with, and they do financial materiality. So in our standards, as we do also impact reality. If you did like GRI before, you're a little bit close to that, but I think the most challenging for the companies is how to apply that. And if you think of, so at least what we saw when we developed the standards, we said, well, if you come from a double materiality perspective, so the climate standard is something that everybody or every company has to say, well, that's definitely material for us. I mean, think about it. If you say nowadays climate change is not material for us, I would put a huge question mark on that. Second point, I think, what companies are also struggling with when you look at the DMA is the reporting about the social issues. So we have, especially for own workforce, a lot of additional requirements right now that we are asking for. And at least the European Union companies have not been reporting that much about their own stuff. And again, the same question. If you say nowadays, so at least in Europe, we are a little bit short on the market right now. So if you say my own workforce is not material, it's like saying climate change is not material. So that's why we said in the beginning we would like to see it mandatory. But we see nowadays, and Alex, I think you can also maybe report a little bit on that. That's the most challenging issues regarding the double materiality analysis. Yes.
From my perspective, because I also work for the disclosure of the listed company, I couldn't agree more. Especially when we face against different investors, they not only ask about environmental issues, they are more and more focused on the social topics, including the workforce you mentioned. How about for Karen? Can you also share with us on that, please?
Yeah, sure. So just to give you a context, so Bloomberg is an ESG data provider, and we actually collect information from different companies in terms of ESG data disclosure. So it's very relevant to this discussion today about the regulations because it's actually impact the data that we can collect for the end users to use. How end users actually use the data is usually the financial institutions like the banks or asset owners, asset managers, insurance firms. So it's very important to actually mobilize the capital to decarbonize and achieving net zero. So when we talk about the EU standard, so we actually hear a lot from the two speakers. So for Hong Kong locally, I think we're actually doing quite well. Of course, it's not actually copying and pasting the ESRS to our standard. We're actually following the ISSB. But at the starting point, Hong Kong Exchange already announced this year in April about adoptions of IFRS 2, which is the climate disclosure. And it is not really a surprise to the market because the market has been having this consultation and hear about TCFD for a long time. And this is a great kind of step for us to move forward to have better data disclosure. Indeed, analysis for the data disclosure for ESG overall, Hong Kong is never really behind. We're actually quite good, actually highest among APAC, and sometimes of some of the largest companies. The disclosure, for example, like BN's company, is actually pretty good compared to the global one. But I think the standard is setting higher and higher right now. Now we have the revolving regulations about the IFRS adoptions, and Hong Kong ICPA just announced not long ago about the consultation about exposure draft to actually make the Hong Kong FRS Hong Kong standards to be actually copying the ISSB standard. So basically, we actually have to be normalized, as interoperability is not an issue with the international standard. I think the little work that we have to do is just like what you said, how to actually make sure that European investors or the lenders for corporate to understand the data disclosure that we have for Hong Kong listed companies. Also, like we don't have the double materiality, so just like what I mentioned. But for Chinese firms, actually for China standard, they actually already ingest the concept of double materiality, which is pretty good. I think it's takes some time for a few years to actually really make sure that the data disclosure is much more normalized and standardized, and globally have a consensus to understand and interpret the information. Because I think while the standard setters actually help us to look into more technicalities of the best standard, I think the interpretations or the end users still need to take a learning curve to understand it. So like SESCA program help us to actually train up our analytical point of view, but at the same time, we have to look into industry specific understanding of how to actually use this information to apply it to day-to-day decision making.
Yeah, just something to add. So because you mentioned it, so first of all, for the climate, when we developed the standard, we knew that companies and also preparers or all stakeholders are very familiar with climate, and that's why we take over the TCFD structure. So if you read through the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, you find the same structure as we saw before in TCFD, and we thought that's very easy to apply. And the second point was that interoperability is only possible or much easier, let me say it like that, if you have the same structure. So the ISSB has the TCFD structure, and we also took over the TCFD structure. I think that's a really important point. And the second point, what you said was climate. So for the double materiality, we also talked about a so-called dynamic materiality, which means, impact materiality over the time becomes usually financial material. And that's what you just said for climate. And I think you will see that definitely in climate. Yes, for sure.
And for listed companies, they always have like a very diversified investor portfolio. And some are from the EU, some of them are maybe from other places like the States, etc. So when they reference to the reporting standards, the listed companies, they need to also take into account all types of standards. That's from the first-hand experience that we are experiencing at the moment. Next question is my personal interest. We have been facing a very difficult experience on Scope 3 Scope 3 data collection, probably with the disclosure in the long run. The next question I would like to ask Professor Basson and also Professor Lopata, because the Scope 3 is very challenging for corporates, especially when we need to do the disclosure in the long run and like setting boundaries, collecting the data, ensuring the data integrity, etc. How can we improve our approach, and how does this align with the global standards? Professor Basson, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, Scope 3 is the most challenging reporting issue. We are aware of that. And there are also initiatives saying, well, why don't you just skip Scope 3 and just take Scope 1 and Scope 2 into account? For example, the SEC in their standard, they focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2. Maybe just an explanation, because I think we're talking very technically here. And for those of you who are not familiar with all these discussions, again, Scope 1 is the emissions you have based on your own transportation, for example, or the own utilities you have. Scope 2 is on the energy you are buying, and Scope 3 is on the products, for example, you are buying upstream, or the products you are producing downstream. So, and the idea of a lot of companies saying, well, if you have Scope 3, we are not responsible for that. Because, I mean, we have suppliers and they are in charge of their Scope 2 emissions, their emissions or our Scope 3 emissions. On the other hand, we don't know what the customers are doing with our products. If we are producing cars, then some are driving long distance, short distance, slow, fast, no influence on that. But the idea is that you should cover what the company is responsible for. And of course, a car manufacturer is responsible for the cars they are producing. and an energy provider is in charge of the energy they're producing. So that is more or less the idea. And we know that scope 3 has, as I said before, 15 different categories, how you can categorize the different emissions you do have. And the most important one for most of the companies of the products they are selling. So let's start with that one. If you're buying a product in your supply chain, then of course you can ask your supplier, what are your CO2 emissions? And they said, well, we have no idea. And then they have to ask, because they also have different components in the product. So, and the idea and the long one will be that we'll have something like a chain where the CO2 emissions from the basis material are collected so that when you are buying a product, you have all the CO2 emissions of the product you are buying. That's the objective. Will take some time, but I mean, with the AI support we have right now, this might be possible. On the other hand, for the use of the products, of course, also there we have technical advantages. It makes it easier to collect the data. But still, we do need estimations. We cannot solve the problem completely, but I'm still convinced that we need this information to completely understand the company and also the impact of the company.
I partly agree, as usual. No, so scope 3 is well, very hard to come up with the data with. So when we discussed in the standard, so it's a phasing in. So first of all, you can not skip it, but you have a phase in before you have to mandatory show your scope 3 emissions. But Alex, I mean, we always discussed it, right? So if you say it's emissions the company or the firm is responsible for, I think you can decide on your upstream, right? You can choose what suppliers you take when you have materials delivered or something else. But on the downstream, it's very hard to decide on the downstream. So if you have someone that's driving a car, you have no, how can you impact them not to drive that much, or how can you influence them? But sure, of course, you can do that. But I'm coming more from my education perspective over here. I think if you educate, the everybody, then it might be easier also on the downstream. But on the upstream, I completely agree. Yes.
Yeah, as I from the listed company perspective, I wish I could only report on scope 1 and 2, but unfortunately, in the latest disclosure requirement from the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong, we anticipate we have a few years for preparation, but in the long run, it's becoming like a mandatory disclosure on scope 3. So a lot of the listed companies, they are planning ahead, or maybe some of the boundaries, like for example, if the suppliers accounts for a certain percentage of business operation activities with a significant amount of percentage, we'll take that into account for disclosure for a first stage at this moment.
Maybe something to add here. So we did not talk about the point that it's right now, it's just transparency that we are asking for with our sustainability standards. So it's not, we don't have a price tag on the CO2 right now, but that's very important also to keep in your head when you talk about scope 3 emission. It's just transparency. If you don't have a target CO2 or whatever, you just say, I don't have it. I mean, the market will then decide if they like it or not.
So we had a very fruitful discussion on the environmental end. The next question I would like to go to Anthony. Just now we mentioned that E is very important, but going beyond the E, S is equally important. We are talking about social impact, just transitions, etc. How do we actually measure that, or maybe report on that in the long run?
Could be Ian. So I put on my day job as a head of institutional investors. I head up ESG function at the asset managers. We have companies across the Asia Pacific, thousands of securities which we need to assess their sustainability performance. And obviously we talked about how we look at environmental very well with Professor Datson's slide on GHG protocol being the foundations of all different standards. Interestingly, one of the roundtable that my company host in Tokyo earlier this year, we work with an international organization called A4S Accounting for Sustainability, and we have the CFOs of all the major Japanese corporates, Toyota, Nissan, you name it. And then we talked about, like what is your main concerns at the moment? And surprisingly, it's not ISSB, not GRI. They're actually telling me about the European, CSOs, exactly, and the ESRS, the non-EU part, because obviously a lot of Korean and Japanese companies that have investments and operations in Europe. And I mean, EU being the regulations coming in place in the first place is definitely something that they really cares about. So so there's a lot of moving forces on that. Now, in addition to what standard setters would do, one of the things that investors would look at very closely is how corporates perform on SDG, on sustainable, on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And a very important part of it is how do we quantify the performance on SDG? And with that, would like to introduce you a very good, useful framework that I look at a lot is the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA. They produce different benchmarks on SDG. So these are not standards. Companies do not require it, but there are additional frameworks or ways to benchmarks where they rank companies' performance. And in Asia, we love rankings. We have that in our blood. So a lot of corporates will be looking at some of the benchmarks that they've been doing, and they have been performing. Interestingly, when I was in PRI in person, which is one of the biggest conference for institutional investors every year. In fact, they're having it this week in Toronto. I come across with a lot of investors globally that they are looking at, for example, the corporate human rights benchmark at WBA. Some of them are very, issues focused, like gender. Some of them are sector focused, could be on like seafood company, what are sustainable versus unsustainable fishing practices, and just transition, a very new topic, which again, a lot of companies in China, Korea, or Asia's company in general, that have been investing in emerging markets and developing economies, and they look at it very closely.
So going back to my workspace, I have extra work to do to reference to WBA for this framework, to measure our social initiatives.
Yeah, I think you guys are actually doing a decent job. Tangas is actually ranked in fact in one of those benchmarks.
So as we improve our sustainability reporting, data providers actually play a very important role. So I would like to ask Karen and also Anthony, how could we actually leverage the data providers to enhance our disclosures and benchmarking, particularly for impact measurement?
Okay, so maybe I will take it first before you, Anthony, jump in. So as a data providers, the most important thing is provide really comparable and high quality data. Also at the same time, making sure that it's like good for time to market. So it's a challenge because if the data is not standardized, just like with the digitalization that you just mentioned, it's very difficult and it's always a time lag. 1 year is about time, but sometimes it takes a longer time because on average, we have to look at about like 7 to 8 different documents throughout the year that a company announced in order to conclude ESG disclosure for a company. So which is really challenging. And for data provider like us, we try our best to really trying to get the information on the public domain rather than doing a survey, unlike some other providers. At the same time, like a lot of like end users of the data, just like what Anthony mentioned, they like ranking, they like scoring. Either they do it themselves or they may want to rely on a third-party rating or scoring company. And this agency usually have those rating and scorings for them to reference to. At the same time, some financial product or index may actually rely on those as a benchmark to compare across. So it becomes really a differentiator if the companies are really looking, using this disclosure standard to help them to actually communicate their corporate sustainability strategies accurately and reflective of what they really do without like some of the concern from the end users of greenwashing. So some of the tools and service available for data provider like us would be a dialogue or communication with companies. I think there's an increasing concern of greenwashing, not only for corporate level or financial institutions, but even for ESG data providers or rating providers. So that becomes a key important to have the transparency. And the transparency come back to the corporate itself. If they have them in the public domain, provide this kind of information clearly without like too much ambiguity, less much on the beautiful image, but really text format. Qualitative and quantitative, just we mentioned some of them, disclosure would be SRS, would be narrative basis. But at the same time, it's actually become a challenge for the wider financial industry to actually use the data, the narratives or qualitative statements to actually make informed decision. So the search of AI technology tool will become handy for summarizations or even they call it GPT, but it depends on the data quality of the data going in. So that would be something that we see like different development, emerging technology and AI to help even data provider like us to help with the extraction of data, but at the same time for end user to interpret and use the information. So when the market evolved so much, I think there's a lot of variety, different products. Some of them would have a niche from different investment managers like entities. But at the same time, for index provider, it's become a really important role to make sure the data is really a high, best in class, and the market is actually use it. At the same time, we have the data provider will have the better data governance and transparency.
So one of the biggest headache that I've got, or if not complaints from my analysts or portfolio managers, is that, oh, how do I really look at or holistically assess company ESG performance? And shall I look at ESG rating A, B, C, or D? Okay. So the way that I've been doing that, well, I've been scratching my head for quite some time, and I've also been complaining to Karen for years. And what we try to do in the end is, we were very lucky. We actually collaborate with Bloomberg, and we established a in-house proprietary template which have captured different companies' ESG performance from different ESG dimensions. Now, the very interesting part, some of them are pure performance driven. Some of them are actually regulatory driven. So for example, one of the very interesting features is that they actually highlighted the PAI, the principal adverse impacts that is required by EU regulations against that's on specific company activities. And at the same time, they are also, I think the database now is actually very advanced in deriving, for example, a company's revenue or business activities that is so-called taxonomy aligned, right? Which we find it very useful in identifying the opportunities, because as an institutional investors, we are forward-looking. So one way of doing ESG investment is obviously we want ESG to help us to mitigate risk, but at the same time we look for upside. And the way that we look for upside, by future opportunities, we look at future revenue growth drivers. And I think that is something that we have been doing.
I want to add on that, for European companies, they will have to report on EU taxonomy alignment. But for Asian companies, if you have an investment universe in APAC, that become the challenges, and we don't really have a equivalent EU taxonomy in APAC consistently. So that's why the estimation that we do is very important. I mean, it's not the best, but still the best effort that we do. But we are looking forward to see how different taxonomy developments evolve, not only applicable to sustainable finance debt instruments, but also on entity level.
So just one remark on the quality of the data. We just finished a paper on EU taxonomy alignment, also with external data provider, and that was before we had the alignment, so it was more the eligibility. And now we can see that the alignment rate you forecasted as data provider was very close to the alignment rate of the companies later. So alignment means how much green revenue, green capex, green opex do the companies have based on this EU taxonomy regulation. So very close.
We talked about lots of opportunity, a lot of good reference points for the audience. To my understanding, I think in the audience, there are a few familiar faces, and a lot of people are actually from the financial institutions. Some of them are actually from the corporates. I have a very difficult question for Professor Bassett, which we want to talk about the challenges and the controversies in the current sustainability practices. How could corporates like us can navigate these challenges?
I'm an academic, so you can expect a very long answer to that. No, first of all, I think it's very important to not only base everything on what consultants are saying and what consultants are doing. We do make this experience right now. Kristen mentioned that before. We have this implementation guidance, and the auditor said you have to follow the implementation guidance, which is wrong. So just build up your own experience on that, your own knowledge on that, because this is not a cost driver, it's an investment. And I think this is extremely important. Also, you might think, why are we talking about the European standards? Just to give you one example on that. You said before, if you have more than 150 million revenues in Europe, then you will have to report based in the future on the ESRS. If you have right now a subsidiary with more than 250 employees, which is nothing, then you have to report based on the ESRS. So the idea might be, why don't we use the ESRS to also fulfill the requirement of the ISSB? So therefore, I think it's very important to build up this knowledge. So I really appreciate what HKU is doing here today to start this discussion and to incentivize this discussion. So this is my key recommendation: build up the knowledge by yourself.
In view of the time, despite I still have a lot of questions I would like to ask, maybe something on biodiversity, something on integrated reporting. I think maybe I should open to the floor for maybe 1 to 2 questions. So can you please raise your hand if you have a question? Please.
So I do want to, as a scholar, I see more problems than opportunities in this field. So my question is about weightings. So you have different companies, MSCI, Bloomberg, also company ask listed firms to provide a lot of data, many questions, 10 pages, 20 pages. This company spent tremendous time and efforts trying to fill in the questionnaires. But in the end, how you weight different metrics, different questions is completely determined by the rating companies, by the index developers, which for the same sets of questions, answers you provide, you can have completely different results. I wonder whether the Standard Association should think about this issue, right? How we provide reliable or reasonable or micro-funded approach to give ratings to different questions. If without that, it's very hard for any company to say this is going to be useful for whatever reasons. There are already maybe 20 or 30 data providers doing those readings, and they all give you different answers. I want to see what's your view on that topic.
So you probably know a paper colleagues published, Aggregated Confusion, where they analyzed the correlation between different ESG data provider, which was, let's say, average was something about 0.6%. We also had negative correlation in some fields. The EU, they started a process in 2018 to align rating, to have a higher regulation on ESG rating. Finally, they just said the raters have to disclose their approaches of how they are developing the ratings and also some weighting criteria. So the idea of having an own independent rating was not successful. At the end, I think this is not such a big issue because there are just competitors in the market and they're evaluating based on with different, let's say, thresholds. We know that some of them have higher thresholds to get a good rating and some have lower thresholds. So I think this is also an idea of how to structure the market. This is number one. Number two, I think the quality of input data, which is so important for Bloomberg and the other data provider, will increase with the higher disclosure requirements. So therefore, I think that this effect will not completely diminish, but it will definitely be reduced. That we have such, well, compared to financial ratings, of course, we do have huge differences between the different data provider, but the market, I think they have a feeling of the expectations and also the ambition of the different data provider.
Yes, and just personal speaking, not representing Bloomberg, I myself don't like ratings and scores because it's a lazy way of looking at a company. If you were all SESCA members, we'd be able to analyze on our own based on our judgment and analyzing the data itself. But unfortunately, like for the market to actually move forward, to be quicker, to actually find a way to mobilize capital to the right place, or even kind of incentivize company to actually be better in terms of corporate sustainability policy and performance, I think like that become a tool for them to actually utilize to see whether they rely on index tracking ratings or just use that as part of the way to look into internal research analysis as one of the tools for them to enable them to see outliers, to see whether there's something that is stood out from them, to actually spend time on looking at red flags, controversies that flag by different providers. It might not be coming to a final conclusion that become a buy or sell decision, but it could be one of the way for risk management or opportunity identification. So I think like it's good to have like more best practice in place, code of conduct, but at the same time, I think users need to actually apply judgment on that.
In view of the time, I think I'll stop here. Maybe we can talk offline for some of the questions. And I'm sure the audience, just like me, have plenty of work after listening to the panel. I need to reference to different standards, frameworks, and also to rely and maybe to double check on the quality data. So if you want to become the ESG expert, I recommend you to actually browse through and register yourself for the SESCA course. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists for the engaging discussion. Thank you so much. Shall we take a group photo?
One, two, three. One more. One, two, three. Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you found the discussion valuable and insightful. It concludes our formal program, but we invite you to stay for networking. There will be an event organized by the Friends of the Earth tonight. So please enjoy your conversation until 4:20 p.m. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Have a great evening. So now standards rating companies